You're thinking about selling your house and you know you need to declutter. But what do you do with that big folder that you got when you went to closing and closed on your house? And it's got all this information. Do you toss it or do you keep it? So we're here today with Rhonda. Hey, Rhonda.
Hey, Melissa.
Rhonda, I oftentimes have this question from my buyers at closing. Do I need to keep all this stuff? And of course I say yes. But why do people need to keep the stuff they get, all the documents they get when they record on their house and they want to sell it, say, 8 to 10 years later? What kind of documentation is really needed when we're going to go sell a house?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, we've talked before about all that paperwork that we're going to get from the buyer to make sure that they qualify to buy this home. But that's only 50% of the package, right? The other 50% is that property. So we want to make sure not only are our borrowers qualified to own that home, we want to make sure that that home is qualified for the financing these borrowers are using. So there's quite a little list of things that a seller is going to want to have together to give to that buyer and the lender to show that this home qualifies. So one of the things that is in that package is probably going to be that deed that says, here's who owns this property. And that's super important for you because who's the seller? Who really is the seller, right?
Well, that's true because sometimes when you bought your house 8 to 10 years ago, a family member, a parent actually co-signed on your mortgage because you needed it because you were younger and possibly didn't have the credit history that was needed. So it made it nicer to add a parent to or a family member to your mortgage. And they're on the deed to the house. So when you go to sell it, we have to look at that deed and all parties that are on the deed have to sign at closing. They should sign the listing agreement also because we should never be putting a property on the market without every seller's or every owner's signatures. So yeah, the deed is something we definitely need to look at. And that should be in that big packet, right?
Right. And then sometimes, maybe somebody's passed away or maybe you've added somebody onto your title or taken somebody off your title. So we really need to take a look at that title report to see exactly who's on there, who the seller is, and who needs to sign all the appropriate documentation. Another thing that might be in that package is when you buy it, then the seller is required to fill out a disclosure form, right? And so when you're ready to sell your home, then you have to fill out that disclosure form based on your experience in that home. And there might be some information on that disclosure form to help you fill out your new disclosure form for a new buyer.
Well, and we just, as real estate agents, every 2 years, we have to renew our licenses. So this year, part of our required every licensed real estate agent in Alaska that will renew their license in January had to take a course on that disclosure form because the state finally, after 15 years, updated the form because it didn't ever have a section in there, NA, not applicable, because not all properties have all those things listed on the disclosure. And so the disclosure has to be completed whether you've ever lived a day in the property. It should be completed to the best of the ability of a heir to the estate. And there is some information the heir to the estate can actually add to the property disclosure. But anything that is 1 to 2 units has to have a property disclosure. And the interesting thing about that is the state of Alaska is starting to really bring more awareness to that because the disclosure is my way of saying, as the owner of the property, the things I know about the property and let the new buyer know those things. Whether there's written reports or things that I've done, like replace the garage door or replace the boiler. And so property disclosures are, they take a little bit of time to complete, but they're very important. And I loved your comment is in that big packet, when you were buying your property, you should have gotten a property disclosure. So sometimes pulling that document back out as you're trying to fill out the new one does help because sometimes it might even have the name of the builder on there, which again, nobody else else knows. So some of that information to go back and look in that packet you get when you go to recording and all the documents you got from your real estate agent and lender is super important. Yes.
Right, right. And then I think another important thing that a seller needs to have handy is their current mortgage information, right? Because that's a loan that's going to get paid off and cleared from the title. So just make sure in this paperless world that we work in, that you make sure, I think that when you're talking to your realtor about listing the home, that you have that payoff information. And I think that that's also important, right? Because you do a seller's like cost sheet kind of a thing, right?
It's a seller net sheet. So we look at the comparatives in the market, what we would list your house for low, average, high, and then what that would net you at the end minus all the fees and your mortgage balance based on the information I can get from public record. I input there. Remember, when you do go close on a house, you do have to pay your first and your second. So if you did a first mortgage, you have a HELOC and any other thing that's attached to the house. And if you did a forbearance, you need to be calling and asking what your real payoff is. I do know that title companies have indicated that payoffs right now are sometimes taking up to 14 to 21 days. So like Rhonda said, having all that information about where and who you're paying your current mortgage to is super important, because the title company is the one that has to order the payoff. You can order your own payoff, but it's not the same one that the escrow and title companies use. But yes, having your mortgage information handy on who your current mortgage holder is super important.
And I think another document that's in that package that's really important is the as-built survey, right? So that's going to show exactly where the house sits on the lot, where your lot lines are there any easements or encroachments, if you have a well septic, where they're located, where your driveway is. And a lot of times you don't need to update that if there's been no changes to your property. So it could have been done 30 years ago, but if you haven't made any changes, it's still valid. You don't have to update that. However, where I've seen people get caught at having to update this kind of at the last minute is we'll see kind of the footprint of the house and the driveway, but then we get the appraisal report and the appraiser's taking pictures, and we'll see a beautiful back deck, or we'll see a shed in the back, or we'll see a fence, or we'll see things in those pictures that aren't on that survey. So really pull that survey out and take a look at it and make sure it's accurate. And again, if you get an updated one, it's good until something changes on the property. So there's no harm in getting that updated as early as possible.
And the cool thing about an as-built survey is I've sold properties that had a fence encroachment. I've sold properties that had a shared driveway. Those things were agreed upon by the current owners. So there was nothing really in writing. So all we did is we got together with a local title person and we put together an agreement so that when that property changed hands, the new buyer, who was not the old-time friend of the sellers, didn't have a problem, because the lender won't close on a property with encroachments on it without a signed agreement. You can't have a shared driveway. You can't have a shared well. You can't have a shared septic system. Might sound funny, but I heard about a property the other day that when they went out to do the engineer's report and the septic inspection, the septic was a 5-bedroom septic that was shared by 2 properties, and neither property had a shared septic agreement in record. So again, just kind of some wonky things that we see here in Alaska, because a lot of times we're selling a house for the first time, and there might not be that packet from when you got your mortgage, but it's all the documents that you collected along the way as you built your property or had your property built. So keep all of those things. They're super duper important. And the as-built survey is just it makes the buyer feel better that they know what they're buying and they know exactly where their lot is. And if they want to put a fence later, they can just hand that to their contractor and say, here's my as-built survey that shows where my fence line is or where the fence line should be. So it keeps us out of disagreements in the future.
There you go. Yep. I think another important piece of information as a seller to make sure you have handy is if you are a member of a homeowners association. So if you're in a condo or a townhome or a subdivision that has a homeowners association. So any of that information is going to be important from a lending standpoint. We're going to need to know what those HOA dues are. We're going to ask for a questionnaire to be filled out. We're going to look for a resale certificate that gives all the information to the new buyer. about the association and what all those rules are and what the budget and meeting minutes look like. So that's all very important information to gather together when you go to list your home if you're part of a homeowners association.
And so if you are part of a homeowners association, you need to be actively involved. You need to be checking the minutes regularly. I just had a client who called and asked me to help her sell a property. One of my second things to do is ask about the HOAs. So are you current on your HOA dues, and are there any special assessments being levied? Because I know that the lender is going to ask that, and it also too is part of the disclosure part. If we're going to list a property that has a special assessment coming up, we need to let the buyers know how that's going to be handled. Now, if you're a seller that is sitting on a property that has a special assessment, it doesn't always mean you have to pay it when it records, but there has to be an agreement at closing on how that's going to get paid. And sometimes, depending upon what the market's doing, sometimes buyers will take on that expense or will have the buyer or the seller pay it at closing. But the interesting thing is she had no knowledge that the special assessment was in fact going to take place because she never read the HOA minutes. I called the HOA manager and said, hey, are the dues current? Can you tell me anything about this? Are there any special assessments coming up? And she said, yes, 2 boilers went out. And because of the snow removal from last year, we went over budget on snow. So they voted to collect more money this year. And so, yeah, there's a $3,000 special assessment levied on the property now. So you have to be knowledgeable about that. You can't hide it. If you're a seller thinking, oh, I know they're going to want to do a special assessment next year and paint it. If it ends up being in the minutes, guess what? That's part of the resale certificate because that stuff is sent. Not only does your real estate agent look at it, you as the seller should look at it, buyer should look at it, the other real estate agent should look at it, the lender looks at it, the underwriter looks at it, and the escrow officer looks at it. So don't try to hide it. It is what it is. We can talk around it and sell around, but all that information is super important to know. Yes, Rhonda, you're right.
Yeah, I think another important thing a seller can get together is kind of their utility bills. And I know that at the end of the year, you get your December, January, February statements that say you used this much throughout the year. And those might be good to save or have handy because that's important information for a buyer to make a decision. And so there's a lot more into that decision besides just the sales price, the interest rate, the monthly payments. What does the utility bills look like for that home? Can I really afford that? Am I on electric or natural gas or propane? Or, what does that look like? Because that's really important in that big decision process for a buyer.
Well, because especially if you're a first-time home buyer going from renting to owning and you're not used to paying your utilities because your utilities are all included into your rent, you need to be knowledgeable about that. So one of the things that was great about this year's class, the designated course that we all have to take as real estate agents, is that's part of the disclosure. There's a section in the disclosure that lists all the different types of utilities that might be at a property, and then there's a little other. And so if you own a property and you're a landlord, you know how much the utilities cost. So you need to be disclosing that because it is something where the other day I went up to a property that's 5,600 square feet. Her gas bill is $110 on average a month. I was like, whoa. And she handed me the bills to support that. So for me as a listing agent, that is something I can use to market that property because you can now buy a 5,600 square foot property. And this is what your gas bill is because the house was built 2x8 construction and it's got in-floor radiant heat and it just stays nice and warm, but not too warm. And my gas bill is way more than that on average. So again, like Rhonda said, those utility bills.
Yeah, I think that's a really great selling point.
And so knowing those utility bills.
Yeah. Another important thing might be, the property tax records. So, sometimes you might have an exemption for being a senior citizen or a first responder or a veteran or disabled so there's some different exemptions that you might be getting. And I think it's important for a new buyer to know what are the taxes really going to be if I don't qualify for those same exemptions. So I think just having those tax records and knowing what the full property taxes would be versus what actually might show up online for taxes owed. So I think tax records might be another important thing to have handy handy.
And that stuff is public information, easy to grab off any of the Muni or borough website. And Rhonda's exactly right, because again, I specialize in selling estate sales. So I end up selling a lot of properties where there are very limited taxes due because the owner took advantage of the residential tax exemption plus the senior tax exemption. That does not pass over to the new buyer. The new buyer that's 22 years old does not get to take advantage of the senior tax exemption. So sometimes the way that that's expressed in the MLS data is not accurate, because like what Rhonda said is it should actually reflect what the true property taxes that are levied by the city, not the advantage that the owner has gotten to take of to reduce that cost. So that should be something. And you as a buyer, you can go look that up on your own. Just look the property address up on one of the sites and look to see really what the true cost of the property taxes are. The great thing is your lender, like Rhonda, is going to tell you the truth about what the true cost of the property taxes are, because it's going to be part of your payment. So knowing up front would probably be the smarter way to go on that.
Yeah, exactly. I think too, there's quite a few sellers that are kind of doing a pre-listing inspection with a home inspector, and sometimes that's satisfactory to a buyer, so they can see that an inspection was already done and they feel comfortable enough not getting their own. Or you can prepare yourself as a seller for what might come up on a buyer's home inspection. So spending that few $100s to get that pre-inspection done, I think is also super important. You can go ahead and address those things perhaps ahead of time, or adjust your price accordingly, saying, I'm not going to fix any of that stuff, so the price has been adjusted to accommodate that. So I think that it's just really important to have that information and not get sideblinded by it, by having a buyer come in and do an inspection report and you say, what?
Well, and the interesting thing is when they the state of Alaska revised the property disclosure, home inspections for the last 7 years, any home inspection. So when we have a lot of military movement, like we do in the Eagle River area, you bought a house 3 years ago because you were PCSing here, you got a home inspection. Now, because you might have bought it during the time in the market when you could do a home inspection, but the seller really wasn't interested in doing any repairs, your lender was okay with that, the appraiser was okay with that, but now you have a roadmap. That's what I always tell my clients, my buyers, is when you get a home inspection, keep that in a drawer somewhere in your kitchen, and then pull it out once every 3 months and look at the health, life, and safety and significant repairs, and just start doing those things. Because the one thing is, the next home inspector is going to find 90% of those things and probably 30% other things. So sometimes my sellers will say, oh, well, we'll just go get a new home inspector. I hated that home inspector. Guess what? They all really follow the same rules, the ASHI rules, and they have to look for the same thing. So you can't just hide it under the table. I love Rhonda's idea of doing the pre-listing home inspection. I have a home inspector that does that. Not all home inspectors will do pre-listing home inspections. Not sure why, but I recommend it often when I go to meet a client and we know we're not putting a house on the market for 6 to 9 months. Go ahead and get that pre-listing home inspection. Take the winter to get all those little tiny things fixed, and then keep receipts of everything you got fixed. Buyers love that. They think that you know what's up with your house now, especially if you've never had a home inspection. How do you know? So yes, having that home inspection report handy is a good thing. So put it in a folder. And so now our folder is getting thicker.
Bigger and bigger. Bigger and bigger. I think another important thing to keep handy is, especially if you do buy something like new construction or a remodel and there's new appliances, new things in the home, and they all come with different warranties and owner's manuals, and make sure that you have those all handy so that you can hand them over for a new buyer. So any of that kind of paperwork to keep together for the new homeowner, because you're used to it, you know what buttons to push on that oven to self-clean it or whatever, but not everybody does. So just keep those things handy, I think. Another thing you were talking, go ahead.
So what's really great about that is the impression it gives a buyer when they come to the final walk and that stack of that appliance information is there. It makes them feel like you cared about the property and that you're willing to share. Now, those appliances aren't, you didn't create them, you didn't make them, you didn't build them. They all have their own little idiosyncrasies. But like Rhonda said, is with all these new digitally enhanced appliances, sometimes it's super frustrating. The power's been going off, right? The power's been going on and off and on and off for the last 2 weeks. So the third time it went off this week, my refrigerator started blinking blue light. I don't know what the blue lights meant. So guess what? I don't have a manual for that refrigerator. So what did I have to do? I had to go online, Google it, look up the model number, all that kind of stuff, and figure out how to return my refrigerator back to where it was supposed to be without those blue lights flashing. Had I had the manual, I would have just sat there, opened it up, boom, known what to do. So yes, keep all those things. And so now our pile's getting a little bigger, but that's okay.
Yeah. Another thing to keep in mind is when it does come time to closing, are you even going to be in town? So if you're a seller, you could be moving to another state, you could be moving to another town, you could be moving out of the country. So what are your plans? You're going to want to really make sure that you have that. Where are you going to go when you have to pack and move? I had one buyer a couple of years ago, and it was a couple weeks after closing, and we'd already graduated and everything. And a couple weeks later, she called me up and she said, "So when do I get to move into my house?" And I said, "What do you mean you haven't moved in yet?" She said, "Well, no, the seller hasn't even started packing yet." And so I talked to the listing agent, and the listing agent said, "What do you mean the seller hasn't moved out?" I went and talked to the seller, and she's like, "What do you mean I have to move out of my house?" So anyway, some very miscommunication going on there. So where are you going to be moving? When do you have to be out? Where do you have to be? What does that timeline look like? What happens if you're not in town when closing actually happens? So maybe looking into the possibility of a power of attorney, or are you going to be in one spot where documents can be emailed and shipped back? Are we going to need to mail things out? Do you have an opportunity to print them? Can you go to a local title company near you? So just looking at that timeline of where are you going to be on that closing day, and how do we get those documents to you to finalize?
And so normally what we try to do is when we know a seller is going to be driving down the Alcan after we get the appraisal in, then we do what we call a pre-signing with the wet signature documents. Because there are some signatures that both the lender and the recorder's office require to actually be signed in person in front of a notary. And so what's great with that is the deed can be requested. Attorneys draft deeds in Alaska. That's something that they started years ago so that they're legal and written correctly. And so those deeds can be ordered early with your escrow officer sitting there waiting, and then the seller can go pre-sign. The one thing is we have yet to have a blender agree to allow a buyer pre-sign documents. So there are documents that have to be signed after closing disclosure is issued to the buyer, and then all those things are settled between the escrow company and the mortgage company, and those can be digitally signed. That seller statement, that seller settlement statement can be digitally signed, but I have to know where you are. And if you're driving through the Alcan, we kind of need to be timing that, because there's pockets where you can pull over and you can have good mobile access, but you can't go MIA on us because we can't record without those signatures. So definitely working backwards. That's how I always start a listing appointment, is when do you want to be moved out? How are you going to move out? When are you going to move out? And then how are we going to get there?
Right. And another option is perhaps a power of attorney. So if you have someone that's going to be local that you trust, that you can look at everything online, and you can approve the power of attorney to sign it, but then that power of attorney can actually physically go in and sign on your behalf and have it notarized and everything. So that's another possibility.
And what's great is most of our lenders have worked out a way to, there is notaries up at the slope. So if you currently work up on the slope, whether you're a buyer or a seller, they have that all figured out. It's no big deal. It does sometimes take a delay. Like Rhonda said, if you're a seller and you live out of state and you need to sell this property, how can we get the documents to you? Most escrow companies now have mobile notaries because most of the title companies won't do sister closings, as we used to call it. So they use a mobile notary, somebody that'll just come to your house, or you can actually print the documents off, take them to the bank, get a notary to sign them and ship them back. It's just when we have out-of-state signings, it does require a little bit more communication, because there are some ways that notaries sign things in different states that aren't always accurate. And we get those documents back. The escrow officer reviews them and realizes there is a mistake. We have to start over. So communication is super important during all this. Mm-hmm.
Right. I think one more thing that you might have in that big packet of stuff would be your certificate of occupancy. So when the home was built, then somebody inspected it and signed off on it and said, yep, this home is ready to occupy. Now, not all areas have certificate of occupancies or COs, right? And so for those areas that don't issue those COs, then you might have independent building inspections. And they would be evidenced by a summary of building inspections called Form PUR 102. That just is a list of all those inspections that were done. And it may have another document that has an energy rating that shows when the home was built, what the energy rating was. And if your home was built after 1992, then, and your buyer wants to use Alaska Housing Financing for their loan type, then these documents are required. So what happened in Alaska, Melissa, you probably remember, is that, when the pipeline was built, it was started in the late 70s, went into the early 80s, and then it was finished like in the mid 80s, right? And all of these people that had come up to work on that pipeline flooded Alaska, and the population just blossomed and mushroomed out, and there wasn't near enough housing. So we had a lot of builders also come up to build because our local builders couldn't keep up with that kind of demand from this onslaught of new families in Alaska. So new builders came up, they built the homes, and the market was just going wild and crazy. And then the pipeline gets done, and 90% of the people get laid off. And now all they need is a crew to run that pipeline. So everybody comes back into the, Fairbanks, Anchorage, all the different communities, and they're like, well, got to find a new job. There wasn't near enough jobs to support that population. So, okay, better put the house on the market and sell it and go find a job somewhere else. And so now suddenly our market was flooded with homes. Property values went down because there was so much inventory, and everybody left the state. Homes went into foreclosure, and it just created that whole mid 80s era that we had. Well, when Alaska Housing foreclosed on some of those homes, on some of those people, and they went and looked at the condition of the home, they found very poor construction, not suitable for Alaskan weather and climate. They weren't energy efficient. They were poorly built for our area. Some of them just plain poorly built, but definitely for our area, they weren't really insulated well and that type of thing. So Alaska Housing spent millions and millions and millions of dollars to refurbish these homes and bring them up to better standards. So they said, boy, did we learn our lesson now. From this day forward, June 30th, 1992, we will no longer finance homes that didn't have some kind of independent inspections and an energy rating to show that at least hit a minimum energy standard to match our climate here. And so that 1992 date is really important. If your home was built before that, you're just kind of grandfathered in. But from 1992 forward, you needed to have those, either the CO, if you're in a city limits that issues building permits and certificates of occupancy, or you need to have those independent building inspections done and an energy rating in order for that home to finance Alaska Housing. So if you have those documents, they're typically recorded, so they are a public record and we can oftentimes find them. But if you got them, but you didn't happen to do Alaska Housing Financing when you bought your home, they might not have gotten recorded, and you might have them in that stack of paperwork. And those are super important to see if you've got anything like that.
And we actually had that happen recently, where my seller was convinced that when they bought the house, they knew that it had been certified by an energy guy. They just remember being told that when they bought it. 9 years, 10 years later, we went to look for the records of that PERS 101 and PER 102 being recorded. And what we found is they had been recorded with the right lot number and block number, but a different address, because at the time that the little subdivision was constructed, this Anchorage gave them one address, but when it actually got finished and completed, they changed the address. So that took a little finagling and got that a little bit fixed, because it was the right house, it was the right lot. It was just that the Anchorage municipality had changed the address. And I've had that now happen on 5 properties in the last year, where it used to have a different address. Now it's got this address because the state of Alaska came in and took some land and
911. They changed some things for 911 purposes, I remember.
And so it's just very interesting. And so again, any documents that you have that are relevant to your property, just put them in a box somewhere when you're decluttering. Don't toss that stuff, because sometimes it's that one little piece of paper that Rhonda and I need that we're like so excited. Because just because it got done doesn't mean it got recorded or it got scanned and put into the system. So we found that a couple times too, that we found recorded documents with the book and the page number at home, but it wasn't on the website because somebody just didn't scan it. So we got those things corrected, but yes, do not toss those things. Keep them, please.
And I think one last piece of information that is important is if you have a private well and septic. And so not all loan products require that a test be done on a well and septic, and not all buyers require that a seller provide those testing results to them. However, if you're in an area like Anchorage, then Anchorage requires it, right?
Well, Anchorage it was started, I can't remember how many years ago, but they call it a COSA, Certificate of On-Site Adequacy or something. It's a COSA. And so what that requires is, because we have houses built up the hill, and a lot of those houses are old. They had old septic tanks that were metal. And so over years, metal typically deteriorates under the ground because, of course, it's filled with stuff, but then it's also the ground that's surrounding it. So what they found is there was leakage. So they they passed a rule here, and so it's for the whole Anchorage Bowl area. It includes Anchorage, Eagle River, and Chugiak, where when you buy a property, you have to have a COSA. Doesn't mean the seller has to pay for it, but there should be a COSA on the property which does the well and the septic inspection and all the records that came with that property. And then if there's variances that have to be done, but yes, there's a cost to the Muni, because the Muni was just trying to make sure that as we're transferring properties, that we're cleaning up some of those old septic systems and not allowing that stuff to still seep in the groundwater, which, because as we're growing, putting in more wells, and we need to not have that stuff seeping in the water. So yes, that's how COSAs work in Anchorage.
Right. So look in your stack of papers and see if you have your previous well septic approvals. On the water, generally they're going to want an updated test to show that there's no coliform, no bacteria in your water. Some of the lenders and some of the loan programs would like to see more water tests with lead and arsenic and there's a couple other ones.
Nitrate and nitrate.
Nitrate.
The nitrate and nitrate. There's two. There's a nitrite and a nitrate. There's just one little letter difference there. But those are found to cause harm to pregnant women. So the water does need to be tested. Mm-hmm.
Right. So sometimes some of those test requirements are a little more difficult for us here in Alaska because of the limited lab availability to perform the tests. But at the very, very minimum, we want to have at least a coliform test to make sure that there's no bacteria in the water. So if you have any of those records, bring those out. You may need to update them depending on the financing and the borrower. You may not, but just be prepared with any past records that you have. So I think that's a pretty big list. Our stack is pretty tall. But as a seller, those are some things that you want to prepare for, because we've got 50% buyer and 50% property. And so you've got as much weight on the seller side as the buyer has on their side to bring that together to go to closing.
And by keeping all those documents handy, it eliminates the delays that we sometimes see. Like, I'm sure as you're talking to your friends and your buddies, you hear about these hiccups, or my house, we couldn't close it for 2 weeks because we got to go find this and we got to go find that. The thing is there's standards and there's guidelines. And so depending upon whatever buyer loan program is, there's guidelines that have to be checked off. So the more information we gather up front, the better off we are. If you built your house yourself, you should know who your well driller was, and you should know who your septic installer was, and you should be able to get those receipts. What we have problem with right now is we have some of those people that did a ton of work here that passed away and their family got rid of all the records. So we are seeing a little bit of an issue with that in the Anchorage area, where we know there's a well drilled because there's water in the house, but we have no record of who drilled the well. So if you are a seller that's doing new construction, save everything that you can think of, because that information does get passed on through generations and generations of that house, because it's information the buyer needs to know, and you should be willing to share. Not a problem. So if you want to get hold of, so those are the top ones that I like. I ask a lot of different questions during the listing appointment, but we covered pretty much everything that I like to put in a listing when I put it on the market. I also go and find all the CC&Rs. Even if there's no active HOA, it's rare to not have covenant codes and restrictions on a property. That tells you whether you can have chickens, whether you can work in your driveway on the car in your yard, whether you can park a boat, an RV. So, from a standpoint of giving all that information up front, it's better to know way at the beginning than after the buyer's done a home inspection, the appraiser's been out, and now shock and awe when they get the preliminary title report. So keeping all that information is super important. And so Rhonda, if you want to get hold of Rhonda, at the end of this video will be a screen. You can reach out to her, you can call her, you can email her, you can click a button on her website that leads you to a Calendly link. You can schedule a time to chat with her, and she will be happy happy to talk with you over the phone or meet with you just like this so that she can talk about what you want to do from a buying standpoint. If you're thinking about selling, I'd love an opportunity to meet with you and talk about what your plans are. My information is at the end of the slide, at the end of this presentation too. So like and subscribe or comment, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
All right. See you next week.